In 410 CE, the Roman Empire formally withdrew its legions from Britain. For nearly 4 centuries, Rome had provided the island with roads, cities, laws, and military protection. With its departure, the structures of governance and civilization collapsed almost overnight. Towns fell into decay, trade networks disintegrated, and communities were left to defend themselves against both internal unrest and external threats. But this was not merely an ending. It was the beginning of a transformation. Over the next 6 centuries, Britain would endure invasions, internal conflicts, and cultural unrest. Kingdoms would rise and fall, new religions and customs would take root, and the island would evolve from a Roman province into a distinctive medieval nation. This is the story of Britain after Rome, from 410 CE to 1066 CE, a story of collapse, survival, and rebirth. In 410 CE, Britain faced a turning point that would redefine its history. For nearly 4 centuries, the island had been a vital province of the Roman Empire. Roman governance had brought roads that linked cities, forts that protected borders, aqueducts that supplied water, and a legal framework that maintained order. The Roman presence had shaped not only the political and military landscape, but also the culture, economy, and daily life of the Britons. But in the early 5th century, the empire could no longer sustain its far-flung territories. Rome formally instructed the Britons to look to their own defenses, acknowledging that imperial support was no longer available. Historians such as Zosimus record that this was not merely a military withdrawal but a declaration of abandonment. The legions that had garrisoned Hadrian's Wall, protected towns, and enforced law were now gone. Without them, the structures of civil administration weakened rapidly, leaving local leaders to manage security and governance in isolation. Economically, the departure of Rome was devastating. Britain's prosperity had relied on trade with continental Europe, the movement of goods along Roman roads, and the stability provided by a unified administrative system. With the legions gone, trade slowed, coin circulation decreased, and towns that had flourished under Roman rule, such as Verulamium, St. Albans, and Caliva Atrebatum, Silchester, began to decline. Villas, once the centers of agricultural production and Roman culture, were abandoned or repurposed for subsistence farming. Archaeological evidence suggests a sharp reduction in imported luxury goods, indicating a shift from a connected economy to localized, self-sufficient communities. The cultural impact was equally profound. Roman Britain had been a blend of local Celtic traditions and Roman customs. Public baths, forums, amphitheaters, and temples reflected centuries of Roman civic life. Literacy in Latin allowed for record-keeping, governance, and correspondence with the empire. With Rome gone, the decline of literacy and formal education began. Urban centers deteriorated, and inscriptions and monuments fell into neglect. Communities increasingly relied on oral traditions and local knowledge rather than Roman administrative and cultural structures. Politically, Britain was fragmented. Power shifted to local warlords, tribal leaders, and regional chieftains, each commanding loyalty in a limited area. Former Roman administrative units, such as the Civitas and Colonia, were no longer functional. These small polities often competed over land and resources, while also defending against outside threats. The northern borders faced incursions from the Picts and Scots, while raiders crossed from the continent and across the North Sea. Coastal communities fortified themselves on hilltops and defensible sites, creating a landscape dotted with hill forts that became centers of survival. Religious structures, while initially maintained, also faced uncertainty. Christianity, which had spread during the Roman period, experienced a reduction in formal oversight. Bishops and clergy had to navigate a world without imperial support, often negotiating with local warlords for protection and resources. Pagan practices persisted in rural areas, and the spiritual life of Britain became a mixture of old and new traditions, reflecting both continuity and adaptation. This period, often called the sub-Roman era, was not a simple story of collapse, but one of transition. Romano-British elites attempted to preserve fragments of Roman governance and culture, while communities adapted to the realities of a post-imperial world. Hill forts became not only defensive positions, but social and administrative hubs. Trade diminished but did not disappear entirely, as some connections with Gaul and Ireland persisted. Agriculture shifted to sustain local populations rather than supplying an empire. Historically, this era laid the foundation for what would follow. The absence of Rome created opportunities for new powers to emerge, from local warlords to eventually the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The skills, knowledge, and resilience developed during this period enabled Britain to survive centuries of uproar, from Viking raids to the later Norman invasion. The collapse of Roman authority forced communities to innovate politically, militarily, and culturally, creating the conditions for the eventual rebirth of Britain under new rulers. Thus, the fall of Roman Britain in 410 CE was both an ending and a beginning. It was an end to imperial order, urban prosperity, and centralized governance. Yet it was also the beginning of a period of adaptation, survival, and transformation. In the shadows of Rome's departure, Britain began forging a new identity, one that would endure through centuries of challenge, conquest, and change. The departure of the Roman legions in 410 CE marked not just the end of imperial rule in Britain, but the beginning of an era historians now call sub-Roman Britain. The term itself evokes a land caught between two worlds, no longer Roman, not yet Anglo-Saxon. Civilization, as the Britons had known it, had receded. Urban centers emptied, villas decayed, and roads, once bustling with trade, fell into disrepair. Yet, amidst this uncertainty, local leaders, warlords, and communities faced a stark choice: adapt and survive, or perish in the vacuum left by Rome. Without Rome's centralized authority, Britain fragmented into small, semi-independent territories. Former administrative units, the civitates and colonii, collapsed, and the former governors and magistrates either left or vanished from the historical record. In their absence, Romano-British elites attempted to assert control. These were men and women who had inherited Roman education, wealth, or military experience, and they sought to maintain order in their regions. However, the scale of responsibility was overwhelming. Resources were limited, populations were scattered, and threats were increasing from all sides. From the north, the Picts, tribal groups from what is now Scotland, pressured the borders along Hadrian's Wall, taking advantage of the weakening defenses. From Ireland, raiders and settlers known as the Scots began crossing the Irish Sea, targeting vulnerable settlements along western Britain. Coastal communities in the south and east faced potential incursions from Germanic groups from the North Sea even before the major Anglo-Saxon migrations began. These threats created a climate of insecurity that dominated the first decades after Rome's departure. The military infrastructure left by Rome, forts, watchtowers, and garrisons, was gradually abandoned. Hill forts, once relics of pre-Roman Britain, experienced a resurgence. Communities fortified elevated locations, creating defensible strongholds capable of protecting local populations from raiders and rival warlords. Archaeological excavations of sites like Cadbury Castle in Somerset and South Cadbury Hill reveal evidence of hastily reinforced walls and timber structures, suggesting a population scrambling to adapt Roman defensive techniques to local circumstances. Without professional soldiers, defense relied on local levies, farmers, artisans, and former soldiers who banded together under local leaders. These militias could protect villages from small raids, but large-scale invasions remained a constant threat. Consequently, alliances between local powers became crucial, even as rivalries sometimes erupted into violent conflicts over land, food, and influence. Economically, Britain was transformed. The Roman system of trade, taxation, and currency collapsed, forcing communities to adopt localized economies. Luxury imports from Gaul, Spain, and Italy, fine pottery, wine, and exotic goods, vanished almost overnight. Coinage became scarce, and barter often replaced monetary exchange. Archaeological evidence from abandoned villas shows a shift from Roman-style estate agriculture to smaller, subsistence-based farming, with a focus on cereal crops, livestock, and essential goods. Despite the collapse, trade did not disappear entirely. Some coastal and riverine settlements maintained contact with the continent, exchanging goods with Ireland, Gaul, and the remaining Romanized communities across the Channel. These limited trade networks sustained pockets of prosperity and allowed some elites to maintain their status, but they were fragile and subject to interruption by raiders or political instability. Monasteries and small religious communities served as centers of learning and social cohesion, preserving elements of Roman knowledge and literacy. Yet, much of the cultural landscape shifted toward local traditions. Celtic languages and customs regained prominence, particularly in rural areas. Archaeological evidence shows continuity in settlement patterns in some regions, while in others, new forms of housing, fortification, and agriculture emerged to reflect the new realities of survival in a fragmented, post-Roman world. Socially, the collapse of central authority had profound effects. Communities were forced to become self-reliant, with families and clans providing security, food, and labor. Leadership often depended on personal loyalty rather than institutional authority. Local warlords, sometimes called tyrants in later sources, gained prominence not by hereditary right, but by their ability to protect and organize people in a time of crisis. These leaders maintained order, mediated disputes, and defended territories, creating the first rudimentary forms of regional governance in post-Roman Britain. The historian Gildas, writing in the 6th century, depicts this era as one of moral and political decline. While his accounts are moralistic, they also highlight the challenges of leadership in a land left without imperial support. His warnings illustrate the constant pressures on communities: raiders, rivalries, famine, and disease. Survival required ingenuity, collaboration, and adaptability. Although the Anglo-Saxon invasions had not yet fully begun, Britain was not free from violence. There were frequent skirmishes between competing local leaders, as well as defensive battles against northern raiders. Archaeological finds, such as weapons caches and hastily built fortifications, suggest that Britons actively resisted incursions. The struggle to maintain territory and resources shaped the political geography of sub-Roman Britain, sowing the seeds for later kingdoms such as Wessex, Powys, and Dumnonia. The legendary figure King Arthur, while shrouded in myth, emerges from this historical backdrop. If Arthur existed, he would have been a warlord or military leader rallying Britons to resist invasions and protect remnants of Roman civilization. While modern historians debate his historicity, the Arthurian legends reflect the cultural memory of a people striving to survive in a fractured, post-Roman landscape. The role of religion. Religion played a complex role in the struggle for survival. Christian communities, though weakened by the loss of imperial protection, often acted as stabilizing forces. Monasteries not only served spiritual needs, but also functioned as centers of learning, record-keeping, and social support. Clergy helped organize food distribution, maintain literacy, and mediate disputes. At the same time, pre-Christian Celtic practices persisted, particularly in rural areas, creating a hybrid spiritual landscape that blended old beliefs with new faiths. This period also laid the foundation for the later Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons. As literacy and religious practice continued to survive in monastic communities, the stage was set for missionaries like St. Augustine of Canterbury to arrive in the late 6th century and spread Christianity to the emerging kingdoms. Cultural and political seeds of the future. Despite the hardships, sub-Roman Britain was a period of adaptation and innovation. Communities developed defensive strategies, reorganized agriculture, and maintained networks of loyalty and leadership. Local warlords evolved into proto-kings, laying the foundations for the heptarchy. Cultural resilience ensured that elements of Roman governance, law, and religion would survive long enough to influence future generations. Archaeology provides evidence of continuity as well as change. Settlement patterns. Populations concentrated in defensible locations rather than sprawling towns. Material culture. Roman-style pottery, metalwork, and coins persisted in some regions, showing gradual adaptation rather than complete loss. Infrastructure reuse. Abandoned Roman roads and forts were sometimes incorporated into local defense or trade systems. This period demonstrates that collapse did not equal disappearance. Instead, it was a reconfiguration of society, politically, militarily, economically, and culturally, that created the landscape for Britain's eventual transformation into a land of kingdoms and later a unified nation. In the mid-5th century, sub-Roman Britain had become a fragmented, vulnerable land. The Roman legions were gone, towns lay in decay, and local leaders struggled to maintain order amid raids and rivalries. Into this vacuum came a new wave of people, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, whose arrival would redefine the island forever. Initially invited as mercenaries to help defend against Northern and Irish raiders, these Germanic tribes soon transitioned from allies to conquerors, seizing land and establishing new settlements along the eastern and southern coasts. Historical sources, most notably Gildas de Excidio et Conquesta Britanniae, describe the Anglo-Saxon arrivals as both opportunistic and transformative. While exact numbers and timelines are debated, evidence suggests that groups of warriors and settlers arrived from what is now Denmark, northern Germany, and the Frisian coast, navigating the North Sea in well-constructed ships. Their initial role was to provide military support to the Romano-British communities, many of which had no standing army. However, the Anglo-Saxons quickly recognized the opportunities presented by a fragmented Britain. Coastal settlements were poorly defended, and regional warlords lacked the manpower or coordination to resist a disciplined, mobile, and militarily experienced force. Over time, these mercenaries settled in the lands they had been tasked to defend, displacing local populations, establishing farms, and constructing fortified settlements. Archaeological evidence reveals patterns of Anglo-Saxon settlement along fertile river valleys and coastal plains, particularly in Kent, Essex, Sussex, East Anglia, and parts of Mercia. They established villages known as ton, organized around communal farming and local leadership. These settlements were fortified when necessary, often incorporating natural features such as rivers, hills, or marshes. The cultural impact of this settlement was profound. The Anglo-Saxons brought their language, material culture, religious beliefs, and social organization. Old English gradually supplanted Latin and Celtic languages in daily use, while Germanic legal customs replaced Roman law in areas under their control. Archaeological finds, including distinctive pottery, jewelry, and weapons, demonstrate a clear shift in both domestic life and warrior culture. The arrival of the Anglo-Saxons was not a peaceful transition. Local Britons resisted the newcomers, leading to frequent skirmishes and pitched battles. One of the most famous, although shrouded in both legend and fragmentary historical evidence, was the Battle of Mount Badon, traditionally dated to the late 5th century. According to later sources, including Gildas and the Annals Cambriae, the Britons achieved a temporary victory against the Anglo-Saxons, halting their advance for decades. Some historians suggest that a Romano-British leader, possibly the historical colonel behind the legends of King Arthur, commanded the defense. Even with occasional victories, the balance of power gradually shifted. The Anglo-Saxons established secure footholds in the east and south, consolidating territory into early kingdoms. These included Kent, Sussex, Essex, and later East Anglia, which became the foundation for the later Heptarchy, the 7 kingdoms that dominated Anglo-Saxon England. Unlike the centralized administration of Rome, Anglo-Saxon political organization was localized and kin-based. Leaders, often called signing king, held authority over extended family networks and their followers. Power depended on loyalty, military success, and control over resources rather than imperial appointment. Assemblies, known as moots, allowed free men to discuss disputes and make decisions, laying the groundwork for participatory governance in Anglo-Saxon society. Over time, these local leaders expanded their authority through conquest and alliances, gradually forming more extensive kingdoms. Wessex, under leaders like Cerdic and Cynric, became a dominant southern power, while Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia solidified control in the north and east. These political entities, though small by later standards, represented the first long-term consolidation of power in post-Roman Britain. The Anglo-Saxon settlements also transformed society and the economy. Roman-style urban centers declined, but rural life flourished under new structures. Villages and farms were organized around family units and local communal obligations. Farming shifted to meet local needs, with cereal crops, livestock, and artisanal production supporting settlements. Archaeological evidence from sites like Yevering in Northumbria shows sophisticated longhouses, workshops, and defensive ditches, highlighting the integration of both domestic and military needs. Trade persisted on a smaller scale. River valleys and coastal routes allowed limited exchange with the continent, particularly in goods like salt, metals, and luxury items. However, the collapse of Roman infrastructure meant that trade networks were less centralized and more vulnerable to disruption. Communities became more self-sufficient, relying on local production and mutual support. Culturally, the Anglo-Saxon period represented both continuity and change. While Roman practices faded, the newcomers brought their own language, art, and belief systems. Early Anglo-Saxons were primarily pagan, worshipping gods such as Woden, Thunor, and Tiw. Sacred groves, ritual sites, and burial mounds illustrate a deeply spiritual connection to the landscape. Christianity persisted in pockets, particularly in Western Britain and in areas with surviving Romano-British communities. Monasteries and churches served as centers of literacy, learning, and record-keeping. This dual religious landscape created tension, but also opportunities for syncretism, as communities navigated old beliefs and new ones. By the late 6th century, missionaries such as St. Augustine of Canterbury would arrive to convert the Anglo-Saxons. But in this period, pagan traditions dominated daily life and governance. The Anglo-Saxons were formidable warriors, and their military tactics reflected both necessity and innovation. They relied on mobility, small units, and strategic use of terrain. Weapons such as spears, swords, and shields were standard, and fortified settlements provided refuge for civilians during raids. Hill forts and earthworks, some inherited from Roman or pre-Roman times, were repurposed to defend communities. Conflict was not limited to Anglo-Saxon versus Britain. Inter-kingdom rivalries among the Anglo-Saxons themselves were frequent. Control over fertile land, river valleys, and strategic coastal regions drove competition, leading to shifting alliances and periodic warfare. These conflicts shaped the map of early medieval Britain. creating the boundaries and rivalries that would define the coming centuries. The settlement of the Anglo-Saxons was a gradual process rather than a single event. Over the decades, waves of migrants arrived, bringing families, warriors, and slaves. Some Britons were displaced, while others assimilated into Anglo-Saxon society. Archaeological evidence suggests that in some areas, cultural integration occurred, with Roman-style pottery, jewelry, and agricultural practices blending with Germanic traditions. Over time, this fusion contributed to the development of Anglo-Saxon identity, distinct from both Romano-British and continental origins. The Anglo-Saxon invasions did more than conquer territory. They laid the foundations for England. By the end of the 6th century, several stable kingdoms had emerged, including Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Essex, Sussex, and Kent. These political units formed the basis of the Heptarchy, which would dominate the landscape of early medieval Britain until the Viking invasions and subsequent unification under leaders like Alfred the Great. Culturally, the period preserved and transformed elements of Roman and Celtic traditions. The Anglo-Saxon language, art, law, and social organization became dominant, shaping future English identity. Christianity, while limited during this period, laid the groundwork for eventual widespread conversion, literacy, and ecclesiastical organization. Militarily, communities developed strategies that would prove essential in resisting future invaders, including fortifications, river defenses, and local militias. Socially, kinship networks, loyalty-based governance, and regional alliances created resilience in the absence of a central authority. By the late 6th century, Britain was emerging from the chaos of sub-Roman fragmentation and Anglo-Saxon settlement. The landscape of the island had transformed. Roman towns lay in ruin, hill forts dotted the countryside, and Anglo-Saxon villages had solidified into early kingdoms. Over the next 2 centuries, these territories would evolve into a more structured political framework marked by the formation of the Heptarchy and the spread of Christianity, creating a society that blended Germanic traditions with remnants of Roman and Celtic culture. The Heptarchy, a term historians use to describe 7 principal Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, came to define political life in early medieval Britain. These kingdoms were Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. While the exact boundaries fluctuated over time due to war, alliances, and migration, each kingdom represented a significant consolidation of power within a specific region. Northumbria, in the north, was formed from the union of Bernicia and Dara, and its dominance in the 7th century set the stage for cultural and religious development. Mercia, in the central Midlands, grew through conquest and diplomacy, eventually emerging as a formidable power under kings like Penda. East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex were located in the eastern and southern parts of Britain, reflecting the earliest and most concentrated Anglo-Saxon settlements. The formation of these kingdoms was neither uniform nor peaceful. Frequent conflicts occurred both between Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and with the remaining Romano-British enclaves. Borders shifted as leaders sought to consolidate resources, control trade routes, and secure fertile lands. Military prowess, political alliances, and strategic marriages determined the survival and expansion of each kingdom. Leadership relied on kinship networks, loyalty, and the ability to mobilize warriors, reflecting a decentralized system of governance distinct from the Roman administrative model. Anglo-Saxon governance combined monarchical authority with communal decision-making. Kings, or signing, wielded power over their territories but relied heavily on the support of the witan, assemblies of nobles, clergy, and free men who advised on matters of law, war, and succession. Local governance within kingdoms often involved sub-kings or ealdormen managing districts, while village communities were organized under kinship structures. This system created a flexible political framework that allowed kingdoms to expand or contract according to military success and alliances. Augustine's mission aimed to convert the pagan Anglo-Saxons, beginning with the Kingdom of Kent under King Ethelbert, who had married a Christian Frankish princess, Bertha. Ethelbert's conversion facilitated Augustine's success and allowed the establishment of Canterbury as a center of ecclesiastical authority, which would later become the Archbishopric of Canterbury. Christianity spread gradually, first through royal courts and nobility, and later through the broader population. Monasteries became central to this process, serving as religious, educational, and cultural hubs. They preserved literacy, taught Latin, and copied texts, including religious manuscripts and works of classical knowledge. Monks recorded events in chronicles that would become invaluable historical sources, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Monastic communities were critical in shaping early medieval Britain. Monasteries such as Lindisfarne, Whitby, and Jarrow became centers of learning, preserving religious texts and classical knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. They provided education not only for clergy but also for the children of nobility, creating a literate elite capable of administering kingdoms, interpreting law, and documenting history. Artistic developments accompanied these religious institutions. The Lindisfarne Gospels, with their intricate illuminations, illustrate the fusion of Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Christian influences. These works were more than devotional. They represented the survival and transformation of cultural knowledge, bridging the sub-Roman past with the emerging medieval order. While Christianity introduced new religious frameworks and literacy, it also adapted to existing Anglo-Saxon practices. Pagan festivals were reinterpreted in Christian terms, and religious symbolism merged with local artistic traditions. Burial practices, previously dominated by cremation or pagan rites, increasingly included Christian ceremonies, although regional variations persisted. The Church also played a role in governance, providing moral authority and mediating disputes. Bishops and abbots wielded influence comparable to secular leaders in some areas, especially where royal power was weak or contested. This duality of secular and religious power became a defining feature of early medieval British politics. The period of the Heptarchy was marked by continued warfare, both between kingdoms and against external threats. Defensive strategies included fortified settlements, river crossings, and strategic use of natural landscapes. The Anglo-Saxon military system was based on a household levy, where free men owed military service to their king or local lord. This allowed for rapid mobilization in response to raids or territorial disputes. Despite internal conflict, this era also saw periods of stability, particularly under strong kings. Mercia, under Penda, maintained dominance over central England, while Northumbria flourished as a center of culture and learning under rulers like Oswald and Oswiu. These periods of relative stability allowed the spread of Christianity, the construction of churches and monasteries, and the consolidation of regional authority. Economically, Britain in this era was a patchwork of local production and limited trade. Villages and towns relied on agriculture, with cereal crops, livestock, and craft production forming the backbone of the economy. Coastal and riverine trade continued, particularly in Kent, Sussex, and East Anglia, where connections with the continent allowed for the exchange of salt, metalwork, and luxury goods. Archaeological finds, including coins, tools, and imported pottery, reveal the persistence of trade networks despite the collapse of Roman infrastructure. Wealth was concentrated among elites who controlled land, labor, and trade, but smallholders and artisans contributed to local economies, ensuring communities could sustain themselves amid regional instability. Language evolved as well. Old English emerged as the dominant vernacular, but Latin persisted in religious, legal, and scholarly contexts. This bilingualism facilitated the preservation of classical knowledge, enabling the church and monarchy to maintain continuity with the past even as the political landscape changed. The spread of Christianity was not uniform or uncontested. Pagan practices persisted in rural areas, and some kings resisted conversion for political or cultural reasons. Conflicts arose between different Christian traditions, particularly between Roman and Celtic practices, leading to synods and councils, such as the Synod of Whitby in 664 CE, which aligned the Northumbrian Church with Roman customs. These religious disputes were intertwined with political power, as kings leveraged ecclesiastical alliances to legitimize rule and consolidate authority. Monastic networks also connected Britain to continental Europe. Missionaries, scholars, and pilgrims traveled between Britain and Rome, Gaul, and Ireland, facilitating the exchange of ideas, texts, and religious practices. These connections reinforced Britain's place in a broader Christian world, even as local kingdoms maintained autonomy and distinct identities. The Heptarchy period also saw the evolution of social structures. Kinship and loyalty remained central, but the Church introduced new frameworks for social organization. Charitable practices, tithes, and ecclesiastical courts supplemented secular authority, creating a multi-layered system of governance. Communities adapted to ongoing threats through cooperative defense, communal labor, and agricultural innovation. Hill forts, riverside fortifications, and early base systems, fortified towns, provided protection and administrative centers. These developments laid the groundwork for later resistance against Viking invasions and eventual unification under Wessex. Cultural output flourished despite, or perhaps because of, political fragmentation. Manuscripts, religious texts, and illuminated works reflect both continuity with Roman traditions and innovation. The interplay of Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Christian motifs created a distinctive artistic style that would influence medieval England for centuries. Education, primarily monastic, preserved knowledge of Latin, law, medicine, and theology. Figures such as Bede, writing in the early 8th century, exemplified the intellectual continuity of the period, recording history, astronomy, and biblical scholarship. These works not only chronicled contemporary events, but also connected Britain's post-Roman society to the wider Christian and European intellectual world. In 793 CE, the serene rhythm of monastic life on the island of Lindisfarne was violently shattered. Monks tending their gardens, copying manuscripts, and performing daily prayers were confronted by warriors from the north who arrived swiftly in longships, their sails black and fearsome, their axes and swords gleaming under the sun. The attack on Lindisfarne sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. It was not merely a raid, it was a harbinger of a new era. These Norsemen, whom later chroniclers would call Vikings, brought with them a combination of mobility, ferocity, and maritime mastery that had no precedent in Britain since the fall of Rome. Their arrival marked the beginning of centuries of conflict, transformation, and cultural exchange that would reshape the island. The monks fled with relics and treasures, but the monastery itself was plundered and burned. This act of violence was a signal to all of Britain that the era of relative stability under the Heptarchy was fragile and that the island's kingdoms, though organized and increasingly literate, remained vulnerable to external forces. The early Viking raids were rapid and opportunistic. They targeted monasteries and settlements along the coasts and navigable rivers, exploiting Britain's geographic vulnerability. Lindisfarne, Jarrow, and Iona were only the first of many religious and economic centers to experience these attacks. Monasteries were particularly attractive to the Vikings because they concentrated wealth, were often lightly defended, and their treasures were portable. Unlike the large-scale armies of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, The Viking bands relied on speed and surprise, striking and retreating before local forces could mobilize. These raids were not isolated incidents. Over the following decades, coastal communities from Northumbria down to Wessex faced repeated incursions, leaving towns, farmland, and churches in a state of constant insecurity. By the early 9th century, the nature of Viking activity began to shift. The Norsemen brought with them advanced shipbuilding technology, knowledge of navigation by stars and landmarks, and a social structure capable of rapid mobilization. This combination of innovation and aggression created a threat that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms struggled to counter. The arrival of the Great Heathen Army in 865 CE marked a dramatic escalation. Unlike the smaller raiding parties of previous decades, this force was a large coalition of warriors from Denmark, Norway, and possibly Sweden, intending not merely to raid but to conquer and settle. East Anglia became their first point of foothold, and within months, the army had moved north and west, challenging Mercia and Northumbria. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, though politically sophisticated and militarily experienced, were divided. Alliances were fragile, and rivalries often prevented a coordinated response. The Vikings exploited these divisions, systematically taking advantage of both internal discord and superior mobility. Their campaigns were devastating. Towns were sacked, nobles were killed or displaced, and agricultural production was disrupted, creating food shortages and social instability. The cultural impact of the Viking presence was equally profound. Norse language, art, and religion began to intermingle with Anglo-Saxon traditions. Place names such as York, originally Eoforwic under the Anglo-Saxons, became Jorvik, reflecting the Norse influence. Settlements often adopted Norse architectural styles, with timber longhouses and communal halls appearing alongside existing Anglo-Saxon villages. Viking mythology, legal practices, and customs began to shape the areas under their control, particularly in the Danelaw, where Scandinavian settlers established communities governed by their own rules. These cultural exchanges were not uniform. They varied according to local resistance, integration policies by Anglo-Saxon rulers, and the size and permanence of Viking settlements. Militarily, the Anglo-Saxons responded with both resilience and adaptation. However, the subsequent establishment of settlements and trade networks introduced new economic dynamics. Norse settlers engaged in trade both locally and with the continent, exchanging goods such as textiles, metals, and livestock. Ports and river towns evolved into commercial hubs, integrating Viking and Anglo-Saxon economic practices. This interaction, though born of conflict, contributed to the resilience and adaptation of local economies over time. The social consequences of Viking incursions were profound. Populations were displaced, and local elites were challenged both militarily and politically. Many Anglo-Saxon nobles were killed, captured, or forced into exile, creating opportunities for new leadership to emerge. Communities became more tightly knit around kinship and local alliances, with loyalty to regional leaders often taking precedence over broader kingdom-wide cohesion. In areas under prolonged Viking influence, a hybrid social structure emerged, blending Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon customs. Chronicles such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written in later decades, reflect both the trauma and resilience of communities confronted by Viking aggression. Oral traditions preserved stories of heroism, defeat, and survival, forming a cultural memory that shaped the narrative of Anglo-Saxon Britain. This interplay between historical events and memory ensured that the Viking Age became not just a period of violence, but a defining chapter in the formation of medieval England. The outcomes were mixed. Though Alfred achieved a notable victory at Ashdown, the Saxons could not dislodge the invaders. Exhausted and outnumbered, Alfred agreed to a temporary peace, likely paying tribute to secure a fragile respite. But peace with the Vikings was never certain. They viewed treaties as tools of convenience, easily discarded when opportunity arose. In 878, Guthrum's forces launched a surprise winter attack on Chippenham, a royal stronghold where Alfred had been celebrating Epiphany. The assault was devastating. Many of Alfred's followers were killed or captured, and the king himself barely escaped with a small band of loyal men. The Viking army overran much of Wessex, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if Anglo-Saxon England would finally fall. Alfred fled westward into the marshes of Somerset, a region of wetlands and dense thickets where he could hide, regroup, and plan. It was here, among the flooded fens and reed-covered islands, that the legend of Alfred's resilience began. In the spring of 878, Alfred re-emerged from hiding and rallied his scattered forces. Messengers were sent across the countryside to summon the FYRD, the local militias of free men. At Egbertstone, they gathered, men from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire, answering their king's call to arms. The army that assembled there was small compared to the Viking host, but it was united by purpose and by faith. Alfred marched them toward Guthrum's army, which was encamped near Edington. The battle that followed was decisive. The years following Edington were a time of recovery and reform. Alfred understood that victory in a single battle would not be enough. The Viking threat remained, and new fleets could arrive at any moment. To withstand future invasions, Alfred transformed Wessex from a vulnerable kingdom into a fortified and organized state. He implemented a system of fortified towns strategically placed throughout his territory. Each served as a local defense center, refuge, and administrative hub, connected by a network of roads and rivers that allowed rapid mobilization. The Burghal Heidige, a document listing these fortifications, reveals the sophistication of Alfred's system. Every settlement was assigned a garrison proportional to its size, ensuring that no part of the kingdom was left undefended. Alongside military reform came administrative and legal innovation. Alfred issued a new law code, drawing from biblical principles, earlier Anglo-Saxon precedents, and his own sense of justice. He sought not only to punish wrongdoing, but to cultivate moral order and social cohesion. In his preface, he emphasized mercy, fairness, and divine guidance, an attempt to define kingship as both secular and sacred duty. His laws strengthened local governance, formalized systems of dispute resolution, and reinforced the king's role as the ultimate arbiter of justice. These reforms were not abstract ideals. They were practical responses to decades of instability and violence. Education and literacy also became central to Alfred's vision of renewal. The Viking Wars had devastated the monastic and scholarly institutions that had once preserved learning across Britain. He also invested in a navy, constructing ships larger and faster than the Viking longships to patrol the coasts and intercept raiders before they landed. Though still in its infancy, this navy represented one of the earliest organized maritime defenses in English history, a recognition that control of the seas was essential to national security. Throughout his reign, Alfred maintained a delicate balance between diplomacy and defense. He corresponded with neighboring rulers and religious leaders, including the Pope, presenting himself as a Christian king defending not only his realm but the faith itself. He forged alliances with the Welsh and maintained uneasy truces with Norse leaders when necessary. His diplomacy was pragmatic. He understood that survival required both strength and flexibility. Over time, his reputation grew, not just as a warrior, but as a wise ruler, a king who rebuilt what war had nearly destroyed. Many terms from daily life, such as sky, law, knife, and husband, bear the mark of this contact, remnants of the uneasy peace that followed decades of conflict. Alfred's reign did not end in total victory, but in consolidation. His achievements ensured that Wessex, once a southern kingdom under siege, emerged as the nucleus of a future England. His descendants would inherit not only his reforms, but his vision of unity, a vision born in the chaos of invasion, refined in exile, and solidified through resilience. Edward's campaigns also relied heavily on alliances with neighboring Welsh kingdoms. These alliances were pragmatic rather than sentimental, forged through oaths, marriages, and the mutual recognition of territorial and political interests. Welsh troops occasionally fought alongside Anglo-Saxon forces, and these partnerships helped prevent Danish expansion into the west. Yet, even as alliances strengthened, the Viking presence remained formidable. The Norse settlers had integrated into local economies, cultivated land, and created fortified communities that required methodical planning to subdue. The campaign was not a series of sweeping victories, but a prolonged struggle, a chess game of siege, diplomacy, and attrition. By the time of Edward's death in 924, significant progress had been made. The Danelaw had been substantially weakened, and many of its territories acknowledged Edward's overlordship. His son, Aethelstan, inherited a realm that was on the cusp of becoming a unified England. Aethelstan's reign, beginning in 924, was marked by military conquest, legal innovation, and diplomatic outreach. In 927, he achieved a symbolic and practical milestone by securing the submission of Northumbria, bringing nearly all of England under his control for the first time. The conquest of Northumbria, however, was neither simple nor bloodless. Aethelstan confronted resistance from local nobles, fluctuating loyalties, and lingering Viking influence. The Battle of Brennanburh in 937 CE, often regarded as a defining moment in English history, pitted Aethelstan against a coalition of Scots, Norse Gaels, and the last significant Viking forces. The victory solidified his authority and demonstrated that a united England was not only possible, but enforceable through military, political, and symbolic power. Following the consolidation of his realm, Aethelstan invested in the formalization of law and governance. Drawing inspiration from both Alfred and continental practices, he codified laws, standardized coinage, and established systems for tax collection, justice, and administration that reinforced royal authority. Monastic institutions continued to play a vital role, serving as centers for learning, record-keeping, and cultural transmission. By preserving texts, teaching literacy, and maintaining religious influence, monasteries helped knit together a fractured society into a more cohesive political and cultural unit. Aethelstan's rule thus represented not only military dominance, but also the beginnings of a sophisticated bureaucratic system that could sustain central authority across a diverse and recently divided kingdom. The death of Aethelstan in 939 ushered in a period of relative instability. Fortifications, baths, and coordinated military organization, combined with the moral authority of the Church, continued to provide stability. The 10th and early 11th centuries also witnessed an increasing interaction between the English crown and continental powers. Diplomatic marriages, ecclesiastical exchanges, and treaties with France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Scandinavian kingdoms created networks of influence and obligation. These relationships allowed the English monarchy to project authority beyond its borders, while also acquiring knowledge of continental military, administrative, and cultural innovations. Trade resumed and expanded along both river and coastal routes, integrating England more fully into the broader European economy. Coinage, textiles, and artisanal crafts facilitated wealth accumulation and urban growth, particularly in towns previously devastated by Viking incursions. Despite consolidation under Wessex, Danish ambition remained a persistent threat. In 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark launched a full-scale invasion of England, capitalizing on divisions among the English nobility. King Athelred the Unready fled, leaving Sweyn to claim the throne. Although Sweyn died shortly after in 1014, the impact of Danish rule was profound. Athelred returned to power, but the political landscape had irrevocably changed. Vikings were no longer external raiders, but now participants in the governance of England. Throughout this period, England's society transformed in multiple ways. Economically, trade, agriculture, and urban centers recovered from decades of disruption. Militarily, the lessons of Alfred's and Ethelstan's reforms persisted, with Buzz, a trained FYRD, and maritime defense providing resilience. Politically, the consolidation of Wessex and later integration of Danish rule demonstrated that the monarchy could adapt and endure in the face of internal and external pressures. Culturally, the blending of Anglo-Saxon and Norse traditions influenced language, art, law, and social practice, creating a hybrid identity that would characterize England on the eve of the Norman Conquest. The period from 900 to 1066 was therefore one of adaptation, synthesis, and consolidation. England emerged not merely as a survivor of Viking aggression, but as a state capable of governance, diplomacy, and cultural flourishing. By the mid-11th century, the kingdom had a defined monarchy, a functioning administration, fortified towns, integrated trade networks, and a literate elite supported by the church. It was a land prepared to confront new challenges, including succession disputes, continental ambitions, and ultimately, the Norman invasion that would once again transform the island. The centuries of resilience, reform, and integration had forged a polity that, while shaped by conflict, possessed the tools to endure and evolve into a medieval kingdom with a lasting legacy. By 1066, England had endured centuries of transformation, from the withdrawal of the Romans to the Viking invasions and the consolidation under Wessex and the Danish kings. The stage was set for a final, decisive chaos that would redefine the island's political, cultural, and social landscape. Edward the Confessor's death in January 1066 created a vacuum of power. Though Edward had ruled for over 2 decades, his failure to produce a direct heir left the succession uncertain, a situation that would be exploited by ambitious claimants from England, Norway, and Normandy. England, long accustomed to internal and external pressures, now faced a confrontation that would not only end the Anglo-Saxon era, but also transform the very structure of the kingdom. Harold Godwin's son, Earl of Wessex, quickly moved to assert his claim, being crowned king shortly after Edward's death. Harold was a seasoned leader, a military commander of notable skill, and a central figure in the English court. However, his accession was immediately contested. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that Edward had promised him the throne years earlier and that Harold had sworn fealty to support this claim. Across the North Sea, Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, also asserted a claim based on a centuries-old agreement between Norwegian and English rulers. England's defense would soon be tested on multiple fronts, revealing both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the Anglo-Saxon system. The first challenge came from the north. Harald Hardrada, joined by Tostig Godwin's son, Harold's exiled brother, launched an invasion of northern England in September 1066. The Norwegian king's forces landed in the north, quickly capturing York and demonstrating their military prowess. Harold Godwin's son, forced to act with speed and determination, marched his army over 180 miles from the south to confront the invaders. The journey was grueling, and his troops arrived fatigued, yet their discipline and morale held. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold's army met the Norsemen in a decisive engagement. The battle was fierce and bloody, with accounts describing the use of axes, swords, and shields in close combat. Harold's forces ultimately triumphed, and both Harold Hardrada and Tostig were killed. England had been defended from the north, but the victory came at a high cost. Harold's army was exhausted, his forces diminished, and news soon arrived that another threat approached from the south, William of Normandy. William's invasion force was meticulously prepared. Months in advance, he assembled ships, soldiers, cavalry, and archers, ensuring that his fleet could transport not just warriors but also horses and siege equipment. Normandy, a duchy already steeped in martial tradition, provided skilled knights, infantry, and a well-organized command structure. In late September, William's fleet crossed the English Channel, landing on the coast of Sussex at Pevensey. Unlike the Norwegian invaders, who relied on speed and surprise, William's approach combined logistical planning, intelligence, and a comprehensive strategy designed for conquest and occupation. Harold, now forced to rapidly redeploy south, marched his weary troops from Stamford Bridge to meet William. The speed and endurance of the Anglo-Saxon forces were remarkable. They arrived in time to confront the Norman army near Hastings. The ensuing battle, fought over 2 days in October 1066, became one of the most famous in English history. Harold's army initially held strong defensive positions atop Senlac Hill, utilizing the shield wall technique that had been refined over centuries. Norman forces, however, employed combined arms tactics, integrating cavalry charges, archery, and infantry assaults to break the Saxon lines. Feigned retreats, a common Norman tactic, drew portions of Harold's men into vulnerability, creating openings for the cavalry to exploit. The fighting was relentless, with heavy casualties on both sides. Harold himself played a central role in the battle, leading from the front and personally rallying his troops. According to chroniclers, he was struck by an arrow in the eye, a dramatic detail that symbolizes the collapse of Anglo-Saxon resistance. With their king fallen and morale shattered, Harold's forces were routed. William emerged victorious, effectively ending the reign of the Anglo-Saxon kings. The conquest was not merely a military victory, but a structural transformation of the English kingdom. The immediate result was the establishment of Norman rule, with William crowned King of England on Christmas Day, 1066, at Westminster Abbey, a symbolic assertion of legitimacy and divine sanction. The impact of the Norman conquest extended beyond the battlefield. Politically, William replaced the Anglo-Saxon elite with Norman lords, redistributing lands to ensure loyalty and control. The feudal system was implemented, binding vassals to the king through oaths of service and establishing a hierarchical structure that centralized authority. Castles were constructed throughout England, from Hastings to the heartlands of Wessex, providing fortified centers for both defense and administration. These castles were not merely military installations. They were instruments of governance, symbols of Norman power, and hubs for controlling the population and resources of the surrounding countryside. Culturally, the conquest brought profound changes. The Anglo-Norman language became the medium of the court, law, and administration, influencing English over centuries and contributing a vast array of vocabulary. Norman architectural styles transformed towns and religious institutions. Stone cathedrals, monasteries, and fortifications replaced or supplemented the timber structures of the Anglo-Saxons. The church itself was reformed under Norman influence, with bishops and abbots appointed from Normandy, aligning English Christianity more closely with continental practices while maintaining the spiritual continuity of the island. Economically, the conquest reshaped land ownership, taxation, and resource allocation. The Domesday Survey, conducted in 1086, documented the extent of William's control, detailing lands, resources, and obligations owed to the crown. This survey was unprecedented in scope and reflects the administrative sophistication introduced by the Normans. The redistribution of estates disrupted traditional Anglo-Saxon hierarchies, integrating Norman lords into the English landscape and consolidating royal authority over both land and people. Markets and trade networks adapted, with new ports and towns benefiting from Norman oversight and continental connections. Though initial disruption was severe, these changes ultimately strengthened the kingdom's economic foundations. Socially, the conquest introduced a hierarchical system that emphasized loyalty, service, and fealty. Anglo-Saxon peasants and freemen often remained on the land, now under Norman lords, experiencing shifts in obligation and governance. The fusion of Anglo-Saxon and Norman customs produced a hybrid society in which elements of both cultures persisted. Legal codes were refined, disputes adjudicated under new frameworks, and local governance integrated into the broader structure of Norman administration. Over time, English identity evolved to accommodate this blend of traditions, reflecting resilience and adaptation despite the trauma of conquest. The Norman Conquest also influenced military strategy and organization. The introduction of heavily armored cavalry, professional knights, and tactical innovations transformed the nature of warfare in England. Anglo-Saxon shield walls and fyrds were gradually supplemented or replaced by feudal levies, mounted knights, and fortified strongpoints. This evolution altered both defensive and offensive capabilities, preparing the kingdom for future conflicts, both internal and external. The introduction of castle-building techniques, from motte and bailey to stone keeps, revolutionized fortification design and control over territory, ensuring that central authority could be projected throughout England. Religiously, the conquest realigned the English church with continental reform movements. Monastic life flourished under Norman patronage, with abbeys such as Battle Abbey symbolizing both religious devotion and political authority. Bishops and abbots were expected to be loyal to the crown, reinforcing the intertwined nature of church and state. Liturgical practices, ecclesiastical art, and administrative procedures were influenced by Norman norms, producing a synthesis of Anglo-Saxon spirituality with continental innovation. Monasteries became centers of learning and record-keeping, documenting the transformation of England and preserving the memory of its past for future generations. The conquest also left a profound psychological and cultural imprint. The memory of the fall of the Anglo-Saxon elite, the death of Harold Godwin's son, and the imposition of Norman rule shaped the collective consciousness of England for centuries. Chronicles such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the writings of Orderic Vitalis preserved narratives of resistance, adaptation, and survival, linking the trauma of conquest with the resilience of local communities. This period became a reference point for identity, governance, and the evolving notion of Englishness, highlighting both the rupture of 1066 and the continuity of societal structures that endured through change. By the end of 1066 and the early years of William's reign, England had been transformed irrevocably. The Anglo-Saxon period, which had begun after the fall of Rome in 410 CE, was formally concluded. The kingdom had absorbed waves of invasions, internal divisions, Viking settlement, and cultural synthesis over 6 centuries, only to emerge under a new ruling elite with structures, laws, and customs that would shape medieval England. Castles, baths, feudal obligations, and continental ties established a framework that would endure for centuries, ensuring both control and continuity. From the chaos following Rome's withdrawal to the consolidation under Wessex, the Danish period, and finally the Norman Conquest, England's post-Roman trajectory had culminated in a transformed kingdom ready to navigate the complexities of medieval Europe. The Norman Conquest was not merely the replacement of one ruling family with another. It was the crystallization of centuries of social, political, and cultural evolution. England's landscape, both physical and institutional, had been remade. Urban centers grew under new administration, rural society adjusted to feudal hierarchies, and the monarchy became both a symbol of authority and a functioning instrument of governance. The integration of Norman legal, military, and cultural practices with the enduring Anglo-Saxon framework ensured a continuity that allowed England to maintain its identity even amidst profound transformation. The events of 1066 were the culmination of 6 centuries of adaptation, survival, and resilience since the legions of Rome had departed, demonstrating the enduring capacity of Britain to absorb, integrate, and endure in the face of conquest and instability. From the moment the Roman legions withdrew in 410 CE, Britain entered a period of uncertainty, fragmentation, and relentless change. What might have appeared as the collapse of civilization was, in fact, the crucible in which a new nation was forged. The centuries that followed were marked by invasion, resistance, adaptation, and transformation, each era layering complexity upon the island's social, political, and cultural fabric. Sub-Roman Britain struggled to preserve the remnants of Roman infrastructure and governance, even as local leaders contended with Celtic rivalries and external threats. The Anglo-Saxon migrations introduced new languages, customs, and political structures, gradually replacing Roman legacies with Germanic kingdoms, each carving out its own identity while negotiating with the past. Christianity provided a unifying framework, bridging old and new, fostering literacy, learning, and cultural cohesion across fractured territories. The Viking Age tested the resilience of these emerging kingdoms. Raids, settlements, and conquest from Scandinavia reshaped demographics, law, and trade, blending cultures in ways that would leave a lasting imprint on England's identity. Figures like Alfred the Great demonstrated that survival required both military skill and visionary governance. His fortifications, legal reforms, educational initiatives, and diplomatic strategies created a template for unified authority that allowed England to withstand external pressures and internal divisions alike. The successive reigns of Edward, Athelstan, and Nut further consolidated the island, integrating Anglo-Saxon and Norse influences while laying the administrative, legal, and military foundations for a centralized monarchy. By the mid-11th century, England had become a kingdom capable of sustaining complex governance, economic growth, and cultural development. Yet, the story did not end with Anglo-Saxon consolidation. The Norman Conquest of 1066 brought the island full circle into a new epoch of transformation. William of Normandy's victory at Hastings was the culmination of centuries of external and internal pressures, forcing the English to adapt to a new ruling elite, a feudal hierarchy, and continental cultural influences. Castles, towns, and legal reforms reshaped the landscape. The blending of Norman and Anglo-Saxon customs redefined language, law, and governance. By absorbing conquest rather than collapsing under it, England demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adaptation. Every era, post-Roman, sub-Roman, Anglo-Saxon, Viking, and Norman, layered resilience into the fabric of the nation, producing a polity that could endure repeated mayhem while forging a distinct identity. The period from 410 to 1066 CE is thus a testament to human resilience and cultural synthesis. From the withdrawal of Rome to the Norman Conquest, Britain was continuously reshaped by waves of migration, invasion, internal rivalry, and innovation. Each challenge demanded adaptation: defensive fortifications to repel invaders, administrative reforms to consolidate power, legal codes to unify communities, religious institutions to foster shared identity, and educational initiatives to preserve knowledge. Through these responses, Britain evolved from a patchwork of Roman towns, tribal territories, and small kingdoms into a unified, centralized kingdom capable of projecting authority, maintaining internal order, and engaging with the broader European world. Reflecting on this transformation, one sees that after Rome was not merely a story of decline or chaos. It was a long, intricate process in which survival, adaptation, and human ingenuity shaped a new civilization. Each era, sub-Roman struggle, Anglo-Saxon settlement, Viking upset, Alfredian consolidation, Danish integration, and Norman conquest, contributed to the identity of England. The legacy of this period endures in the monarchy, legal systems, language, urban centers, and cultural memory of modern Britain. By examining these 6 centuries, we gain not only an understanding of historical events, but also insight into the resilience of societies facing profound disruption. Britain's post-Roman journey demonstrates that civilization is not simply a static inheritance, but a dynamic, evolving construct, one built through conflict, compromise, and creativity, continually shaped by the people who endure, adapt, and rebuild in the wake of change. The story of Britain after Rome reminds us that history is rarely linear. It is a tapestry woven from the threads of survival, conquest, adaptation, and transformation. It shows how communities can absorb shocks, integrate diverse influences, and emerge stronger than before. The centuries between 410 and 1066 CE offer lessons in governance, leadership, cultural synthesis, and resilience. They show that even in the absence of a central authority, human societies find ways to organize, defend, and preserve their identity. They reveal that invasions, migrations, and political war, while devastating, can also catalyze innovation and structural transformation. By the time William of Normandy set foot on English soil, Britain had been tempered by centuries of challenge and change, a nation forged not merely by conquest, but by the enduring capacity of its people to survive, adapt, and create order from chaos. In the end, the period after Rome is a story of continuity through disruption, of the interplay between destruction and creation, and of the enduring human drive to adapt and endure. From abandoned Roman towns to the rise of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the Viking settlements, the reforms of Alfred, the unification under Athelstan, and the final transformation under Norman rule, Britain's history during these 6 centuries reflects the resilience of a society that refused to vanish despite repeated crises. It is a chronicle of adaptation, governance, cultural blending, and survival that not only defines medieval England, but also provides a timeless example of how human civilization can evolve, endure, and flourish after the collapse of a great empire.